Most imagine medieval peasants gnawing on dry bread in silence. But when they could, they devoured something far more dangerous: greasy, filthy, irresistible junk food born from pure hunger. To understand why they reached for those filthy treats, you have to understand the hunger that defined their world. Not the modern kind, not skipping breakfast or forgetting lunch, but a dull, ever-present gnawing that lived in their bones. For most peasants, food was labor. It had to be earned by the hour, by the field, by the cut on the hand. And some days, no matter how hard they worked, there simply wasn't any. Their lives followed the rhythm of physical exhaustion. Every sunrise meant movement. Back bent over soil, feet sunken into frost or mud, hands raw from grinding, threshing, or lifting, all while barely digesting a watery gruel swallowed at dawn. By mid-morning, the body had already burned through it. Muscles screamed for something dense, greasy, and fast. But the midday meal, if it existed, was still hours away. So they reached for whatever could trick the stomach into silence. This is where junk food begins. Not in indulgence, but in desperation. No one fried dough for fun. They fried it because flour and oil were the only things left. No one roasted salted roots because they craved flavor. They did it because salt kept things from rotting, and chewy brine was better than nothing at all. These weren't delicacies. Most peasant meals were plain because anything remotely flavorful was either too expensive or already spoiled. That's what made greasy, salty food so magnetic. It was rare, and it made you feel full, even when it didn't last. A rough fritter soaked in animal fat, or a burned cheese crust from the edge of a peasant's oven, might be the only pleasure in a week of chewing boiled beans. Hunger changed what the body asked for. It didn't want balance. It wanted bulk. It didn't want fresh. It wanted fast. Something hot that could fight the cold. Something heavy that stuck to your ribs, even if it tasted like ash. In that world, a lump of dough fried in reused oil wasn't shameful. It was gold. And the need for speed? It wasn't luxury. It was necessity. Peasants didn't have lunch breaks. There were no quiet moments to enjoy a plate. They ate on the road, in the fields, behind carts, inside stables. The quicker the snack, the better the chance of finishing it before returning to the plow. That's why handheld pies, roasted roots, and flatbreads folded with salted greens became popular. You could chew and work at the same time. Even when there was bread, it wasn't what you think. It was coarse, heavy, and dry. Often made from rye, barley, or whatever grain hadn't been eaten by mice or taken as tax. So peasants flavored it with grease drippings, garlic mash, or even sour ale, just to make it passable. They turned it into something closer to street food, not out of culinary creativity, but because chewing plain crusts every day was misery. It's easy to laugh at the idea of medieval junk food, but that's only because we forget what real scarcity feels like. Every fried scrap, every chunk of old cheese pressed into dough, every cup of hot bran mash was more than just a meal. It was a break from pain. And yet, the hunger always returned. No matter what they swallowed, it was never enough. So they kept frying, roasting, scraping, and chewing, not for taste but for fuel. And in doing so, they created the earliest, rawest version of what we now call comfort food. It was filthy. It was fast. On the edge of muddy roads and noisy market lanes, smoke curled from iron pans balanced over crude fire pits. It wasn't always clear what was cooking, but the smell was thick, sharp, and impossible to ignore. There, in the shadows of the cathedral wall or beside the pig trader's stall, stood figures wrapped in patched cloaks, ladling brown lumps into scorched cloth. These weren't bakers or cooks. They were survivors, hawking whatever they could turn into a bite worth chewing. The oil in those pans had long forgotten freshness. It was reused until it turned black and bubbled like swamp water. Yet that same sizzling mess gave birth to the peasant's favorite indulgence. Dough scraps rolled from leftover grain, coated with herbs or crushed onions, dropped into the grease, sizzling, twisting, crackling. The result? Crisp on the outside, raw inside, dripping with fat and smoke. And peasants didn't ask questions. They paid in copper or bread crusts or favors just to feel something hot, heavy, and slightly crunchy between their teeth. There were no names for these foods. No recipes were written, no portions measured, no ingredients promised. One day you'd get a turnip fritter with crushed pepper if the seller had luck. The next, maybe ground beans mashed with spoiled lard and fried into crooked discs. If you were fortunate, a bite tasted of onion and salt. If not, the taste of rot and ash clung to your tongue for hours. Still, the line never stopped growing. Laborers, children, old women carrying water jugs. They all came. Not for nourishment, but for a moment of fullness, even if it was fake. A belly warmed by fried batter felt better than one roaring with emptiness. And the smell, that thick, greasy cloud rising from those sizzling pans, promised something bold in a world built on blandness. Sometimes the sellers added scraps of meat, though calling it that was generous. Fatty skin, gristle, maybe something once connected to bone, chopped fine, seasoned with whatever could be found, and battered in crumbs. These were strung on splinters of wood or bundled inside a lump of fried grain. No one dared to ask what animal it came from. If it was chewable, it was edible. If it filled your mouth with salt and smoke, it was worth the coin. By midday, the air around these cellars became thick with noise. Pigeons flapped near dropped crumbs. Dogs fought over burnt rinds. Barefoot children chased each other between carts, faces streaked with soot and butter. And still the sellers kept cooking, spooning slop into bread folds or scooping it with fingers hardened by years of grease burns and frozen dawns. There was something ritualistic in it all. The sound of bubbling oil, the sharp hiss when batter hit the pan, the way steam rose like a ghost from the food, vanishing before you could name it. In a world of repetition, those fleeting moments, the bite of spice, the sudden crunch, the unexpected sweetness in burnt onions, felt almost magical. These were the first food vendors of the streets, though no one would have dared call them that. They were wanderers, widows, injured men unfit for harvest work, anyone who could light a fire and steal enough flour to fry something passable. Their profits were meager, their hours endless, and their lives fragile. But in that sizzling pot, they found power. For the buyer, the food was escape, not from hardship, which never truly paused, but from sameness, the endless weeks of boiled roots, sour porridge, and stone-hard bread. One greasy fritter bought under a cathedral's shadow could make a peasant feel like something other than a beast. Even if it was filthy, even if it made you sick, it was yours, fast, hot, and untamed. Because that was the truth. No matter how poor or broken they were, medieval peasants still craved more than survival. They wanted taste, even if it was bitter. They wanted texture, even if it was grit. And in the blistering heat of those roadside pans, they got it. There was nothing elegant or refined about the peasant pie. It was crude, heavy, and stuffed with whatever the kitchen couldn't use elsewhere. And yet, this dense, unevenly baked lump became the secret treasure of the poor. Not for its taste, but for its strength. It could be carried to the fields without falling apart, eaten cold without spoiling, and shared between children without causing a fight. In a world where meals were rare and hunger relentless, this was enough. The crust, if it could be called that, was often a blend of coarse rye, barley husks, and whatever flour remained after the miller took his share. It was tough, dry, and occasionally bitter, but it sealed in heat and kept the filling from leaking onto filthy hands. Inside, there was never meat in abundance. Instead, crushed turnips, sour cabbage, boiled leeks, and fermented cheese rinds formed the bulk of the stuffing. On luckier days, nettles boiled with garlic might add sharpness. On poorer ones, nothing more than mashed peas mixed with salt and suet would be packed inside. Some pies included grated carrots, softened in broth, while others were filled with stale bread soaked in milk and pressed into a paste. No two pies ever looked alike. Each one mirrored the contents of a household's last meal, the leftovers too miserable to serve on their own. Still, The value of these clumsy bundles wasn't lost on those who baked them. For peasants, time mattered, and the pie offered something rare. A meal that could be made in the evening, wrapped in cloth, and eaten the next day with one free hand while the other held a plow. The crust sealed in warmth like a coat for the stomach, and even when the inside had turned sour, it gave just enough weight to silence the body's complaints. There was a kind of pride in making something out of nothing. Wives would spend the twilight hours chopping wilted greens, folding in dried herbs, pressing the edges of dough with calloused fingers until they held tight. Children would wait by the hearth, hoping to lick the spoon or steal a corner of crust before it vanished into the ashes. And, when the pie finally emerged, misshapen, cracked, sometimes blackened on one side, it carried more meaning than most noblemen's feasts. Those who ate it didn't expect pleasure. They chewed in silence, grateful for the warmth, grateful to feel something in their mouths besides cold air. The pie's heat reached the chest first, then the arms, and finally the legs, not from flavor, but from calories. That slow-burning heaviness stayed with them longer than any broth, keeping muscles moving long after dawn had passed. Some bakers added crushed eggshells to thicken the filling. Others stirred in ashes from the hearth to stretch the volume. In some regions, dried beans were mashed with bitter herbs, creating a sticky blend that clung to the tongue. Everything was recycled. Old porridge, spoiled milk, yesterday's stew, the broth skimmed from a neighbor's pot. And yet, within that mess, something resembling satisfaction could still be found. On feast days, when the church bells rang and the village stirred with noise, a rare twist might appear. Pies brushed with egg yolk stolen from the henhouse or sprinkled with seeds saved from last autumn. These were passed from hand to hand, not as gifts, but as tokens of defiance. A reminder that joy, however small, could still fit in a crust. Even in famine, peasants clung to the ritual of the pie. They chewed slowly, closed their eyes, imagined fuller days, and then returned to the fields, backs bent, bellies briefly fooled. In the cold gray mornings of the Middle Ages, before bread could rise and stews could soften, there was always one thing already waiting: ale. Not the dark, bitter kind nobles drank from silver goblets, but a cloudy, yeasty, weak brew that peasants gulped like water. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, both hydration and hunger wrapped in foam. Water, drawn from wells or ditches, often carried death. Parasites, rot, and human waste turned even a clear stream into poison. But ale, boiled, fermented, and sometimes seasoned with herbs, gave the body something it could tolerate. It was safer, heavier, and just familiar enough to feel like home. Every village brewed its own variation, and no two batches ever tasted the same. Sometimes it was sweet, with hints of dried apples or wild honey stirred in before fermentation. Other times, it was sour enough to sting the tongue, thick as porridge and bubbling with leftover grain. No one cared if it was warm or flat. What mattered was that it filled the mouth and settled the gut. One mug could dull the ache in your legs. Two might make the sky look a little less heavy. It wasn't drunk for pleasure alone. Ale was breakfast, lunch, and dinner when no solid food remained. Children drank it from wooden bowls, their lips stained with froth, their bellies slow to cry. Old men drank it with shaking hands, remembering youth that had long since rotted away. Women drank it between births, between burdens, between bruises. It blurred the sharpness of life, just enough to keep walking. In some places, women brewed the ale. Alewives, they were called. Hands thick with grain dust, aprons soaked with steam. They stirred vats from dusk until dawn, poured by the ladle, sang while boiling barley, cursed when batches soured. Their brew was traded, bartered, sold in cracked jugs to neighbors who couldn't afford bread but could still manage a sip of warmth. And warmth it was, not only in the stomach, but in the spirit. Ale loosened speech, brought laughter to stiff lips, made songs rise in throats unused to joy. Around a shared mug, peasants could forget the tax, the whip, the frozen soil, if only for a heartbeat. In dark corners of thatched cottages, stories grew wild on ale-slicked tongues, and sorrow lost its edge. Sometimes, the buzz went too far. Fights broke out, promises were broken, children left unfed while mugs stayed full. But no one blamed the drink. They blamed the world that made it necessary. For many, ale was the only comfort allowed, not just because it dulled pain, but because it could be made with scraps. A handful of barley, a splash of yeast, a pinch of thyme, and something human emerged from the mixture. Stronger brews were rare, reserved for feast days or secret gatherings where someone had smuggled in spices from a distant port. But even the weakest ale held power, the power to soothe, to silence, to soften a day of endless noise. It wasn't escape. It was endurance, packed into a cup. In cold months, ale was warmed by the hearth, thickened with egg or butter when the harvest had been kind. In lean seasons, it was watered down, stretched until the flavor faded, yet still drunk with gratitude. And that feeling of swallowing not just a drink, but a little fire, became addictive. Not because of the buzz, but because of the reminder. Life wasn't only about work. Here could still be flavor. When there was no fresh food to be found, peasants turned to what could survive the passage of time, not just for hours, but for days or even weeks. Smoke and salt, those two ancient preservers, became more than techniques. They became lifelines. Through them, the poor learned to stretch flavor, build texture, and trick hunger into believing it had already been fed. Every household, no matter how humble, had a hook somewhere in the rafters. A place to hang scraps wrapped in cloth or tied with string. Thin ribbons of fat, cured with brine and slowly dried over smoldering embers, became what some called meat. Not for its quality, but for its illusion. It chewed like leather, tasted like ash, and stuck between your teeth for hours. But it filled the mouth, kept the hands busy, and dulled the ache behind the ribs. Some peasants chewed salted roots, sliced thin, baked flat, and then smoked until brittle. Others preserved cabbage stems in vinegar or soaked raw beans in lye before frying them into crumbling discs. None of it was soft, fresh, or delightful. Yet it lasted. In villages plagued by mold, rodents, and theft, durability often mattered more than taste. And in those hardened snacks, something like dignity could still be found. Children gnawed on dry peas like stones, their teeth chipping as they tried to soften the hardness with spit. Elders sucked on salted bark, believing it helped calm the body or cleanse the mouth. Laborers carried pockets full of dried grain mash, pressed into fist-sized lumps the consistency of cold clay. Even in freezing wind or blazing sun, they would pause, unwrap the bundle, and bite until the jaw ached. Sometimes, marrow was scooped from bones, dried in cloth, and eaten in strips like jerky. At other times, peasants mixed pork fat with wild garlic, shaped it into sticks, and left it above the hearth for days. What emerged wasn't beautiful. It was blackened, oily, and often sour. But it resisted rot. It resisted time, and that made it sacred. There were rituals, too, ways to chew slowly, close the eyes, and imagine the flavor of something better. These weren't indulgent games. They were tools of survival. When meals became memories, the act of chewing itself took on meaning. It gave rhythm to the day, grounded wandering thoughts, and made empty hours feel full. In some regions, peasants made tough cakes of mashed lentils, dried until they turned to stone, then softened with spit while walking. Others boiled herbs into hard jellies, salted them heavily, and bit off pieces like bitter candy. The effort required to eat these foods was part of their purpose. By the time you finished, the hunger had faded. Not from satisfaction, but from exhaustion. During long winters, the hearth became an altar of preservation. Fat dripped from iron grates, collected in pans, and cooled into slabs that could be sliced and eaten raw. Smoke curled around everything, not just meat, but onions, beans, Even hard bread soaked in broth and then crisped until it broke like bone. This was food you didn't swallow quickly. It was food you fought with. And yet, despite the hardship, there was something deeply human in the act of saving scraps, drying leftovers, and chewing through the silence. It was resistance, against waste, against loss, against the hollow space where dinner should have been. In every hard bite, peasants found proof that their lives, though brutal, still held choice. In a world where salt was precious and meat nearly mythical, sweetness felt like a memory from another life. For peasants, it wasn't just rare, it was almost holy. The idea of sugar, as we know it today, belonged to cities, merchants, and nobility. But that didn't stop the poor from searching for ways to create sweetness where none seemed to exist. They looked to the forests first. In early autumn, wild apples dropped from the trees, bruised and sour. But when roasted slowly in the coals, their flesh softened, their tartness dulled, and something close to sweetness emerged. Mothers wrapped them in leaves, left them near the hearth, and watched their children's eyes widen with wonder when the steam lifted and the skin cracked open. Sometimes they boiled carrot slices with vinegar and a pinch of herbs, then left the mixture to sit until it turned sticky. It wasn't honey, but it clung to the tongue and left behind a flavor close enough to joy. Others scraped tree bark for sap, collected sticky drops in wooden bowls, and stirred it into warm porridge made from leftover oats. It hardened if left too long, so they ate it fast, licking their fingers while pretending it was candy. The lucky few with access to a single hive guarded honey like treasure. It was measured in drops, hidden from neighbors, and used only when someone was ill or dying, or, on the rarest of days, when celebration felt more important than preservation. One spoonful in a clay cup of hot water could turn a funeral into something bearable, or make a wedding taste like the stories told by firelight. Others experimented with crushed chestnuts mixed with dried fruit peels, then packed into small balls and pressed until firm. These were handed to children during feast days or when tears refused to stop. Their sweetness was mild, their texture coarse, but they softened sorrow for a moment, and that made them priceless. Bakers, when given the chance, made flat cakes from breadcrumbs soaked in animal fat and flavored with herbs that mimicked sugar's warmth. Some used boiled onions to create caramel-like spreads, storing them in cracked jars and using them sparingly over flatbread or dried porridge. The results weren't pretty, nor were they always pleasant, but they reminded the poor of what sweetness felt like, even if only in shape or smell. Even acorns, when roasted and mashed with bits of wild fruit, could become dessert if imagination was strong enough. The process was long, bitter at first, but patience peeled back the edge. That was the key to peasant sweets. Not the ingredients, but the transformation. Pain became warmth. Bitterness turned gentle. And there were rituals. A mother might dip the corner of a cloth into berry juice and let her child suck on it during long church services. A grandmother could mash parsnips, stir in animal grease, and bake the mixture into a stiff paste, not for nutrition, but to soothe a lonely heart. Even the act of preparing something sweet, no matter how humble, carried weight. Though most days were built from roots, weeds, and grain, peasants refused to abandon the idea that food could comfort. They didn't need perfection. They needed reminders that life wasn't just about work, cold, and ache. In these crude confections, however brief, they tasted something brighter, something tender, something that said tomorrow might hold more than survival. Once every few weeks, the stillness of rural life cracked open. The bells rang earlier, the road filled faster, and the air thickened with the scent of unfamiliar spices. Market day was more than commerce. It was chaos, temptation, and escape packed into a single swirling storm of noise, smoke, and scent. For peasants who spent most of their days in silence and repetition, it felt like stepping into another world. Along the muddy street edges, sellers shouted above one another, arms waving, steam pouring from blackened kettles. Peasants drifted toward the smells first, not the goods. Between the linen stalls and the butcher's hooks stood the food carts, wobbly tables, or just blankets thrown over barrels where everything that could be fried, boiled, roasted, or stuck on a stick waited. Coins were few, but cravings were louder, and so they spent what they had, or what they could borrow, on snacks that offered no nutrition but brought satisfaction rare enough to justify the risk. Fingers dipped into clay bowls of spiced beans, barely warm, oily, and gritty, yet strong enough in taste to awaken tongues dulled by boiled greens and cold bread. Nearby, a man roasted animal scraps on a spit turned by hand. Not cuts of meat, just skin, sinew, and fat crackling until it bubbled. For a single copper, you could hold a dripping strip wrapped in cloth, chew until your jaw ached, and forget everything but the salt burning your lips. Others offered flattened cakes made from ground barley and animal grease, patted into shape, then slapped onto hot stones until blackened at the edges. Nothing was served on plates. No one asked for napkins. You wiped your hands on your tunic, your face on your sleeve, and kept walking. The faster you ate, the less chance a child would tug it from your grasp. Some vendors sold sticky ropes of roasted grain syrup, hardened into twists and snapped into chunks with your teeth. Others sold sharp cheese scraps crumbled into stale bread and fried whole, forming greasy slabs you had to fold in half just to keep them from falling apart. Not one ingredient was fresh, but everything was loud. For a few hours, people weren't just working bodies. They became buyers. They became tasters. They made choices. Even if the food was terrible, and much of it was, it belonged to them, not to the land, not to the Lord, not to the rhythm of the harvest. Children ran wild, their cheeks smudged with ash and butter, chasing after cartwheels or begging for burnt sugar pebbles handed out in cloth pouches. Elderly peasants, stooped and slow, clutched steaming mugs of watered wine spiced with clove or spoiled ale, sweetened with berry mash. The air choked with smoke from 10 different fires, each one pushing its own version of delight into the crowd. Behind every greasy fritter, every burned pie crust, every sticky paste chewed in silence, lived something deeper than appetite. Peasants didn't just eat to survive, they craved. Because when food is scarce, desire becomes sharper. People stop wanting what is best. They start wanting what is strongest. Something that bites back. Something that reminds the tongue it still exists, that the mouth still feels, that not everything has been taken. In those cravings, for fat, for salt, for a moment of sweetness, you see not weakness, but will. A determination to taste life, even when it hurts. The hunger itself was constant, but how people responded to it wasn't only physical. They shaped cravings into rituals, into tiny ceremonies of resistance. Frying scraps in reused oil wasn't desperation alone. It was ingenuity. Turning roots into candy wasn't madness. It was hope repackaged as flavor. Even chewing tough strips of smoked grain meant choosing to engage, not surrender. And that's the difference. The poor didn't passively receive what they were given. They transformed it. They seasoned misery with whatever scraps could be stolen, traded, or invented. Not to impress, not to entertain, but to remember, if only for a few minutes, that the world still contained sensation. Cravings became anchors in a drifting life. When there was nothing left to hold, taste offered stability. A burned crust or sour ale didn't lie. It told the truth. It said, "This is now, and it matters." No feast could compete with that honesty. No nobleman's spread could match the raw intimacy of eating something made by hand, by fire, by instinct. Even children learned early what hunger did to the mind. They watched their mothers mash weeds into porridge, their fathers crush beans into cakes, their siblings suck marrow from cracked bones. And in those acts, they saw more than survival. They saw creativity. The kind that doesn't make art, but keeps hearts beating when the days blur and the nights never end. Some might laugh at the idea of medieval junk food. They might see it as grotesque or pitiful. Grease-stained cloths, tooth-breaking crusts, pots that reeked of ash. But that mockery misses the point. The point wasn't flavor. The point was feeling. A chance to bite into something that wasn't just fuel, but proof. Proof that they still had preferences, that they still had power, that they still had the courage to want. Because wanting, truly wanting, is dangerous for the poor. It makes you aware. And yet they chose to want anyway. They chose to reach for something more, even when it came wrapped in soot and sorrow. In every crumb fried with care, in every sip of spiced gruel. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.